Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1. The Roads That Never Let You Go. The gate vanished behind him before he fully registered that it was real. One moment there was concrete and steel and shouting that lived in your bones, and the next there was open road, morning glare, and a car already pulling away as if it had been waiting for years. The vehicle smelled faintly of dust and old fabric. The driver didn't greet him, didn't glance back, just a single, absent nod like a man acknowledging weather. The sack of his belongings sat on the floor between his boots, everything he owned compressed into cloth and weight. The door closed with a sound that felt final, and traffic swallowed them. The driver wore a jacket too heavy for the heat, canvas, faded, the kind of thing you keep because it has earned the right to stay. His hands gripped the wheel with the calm certainty of someone who'd broken skin and bone for a living. Thick fingers, pale scars, work scars, the kind you don't talk about. The man in the back watched the narrow place where the driver's neck met his skull. Soft, exposed. He'd ended lives over less than the cost of this ride. That thought came uninvited, slid through him, and settled without shame. He had chosen the longest route the app would allow. Cross-state, shared fare, cheap. More importantly, endless. He told himself it was practical, that he needed time, that he had nowhere to arrive. Much later, the truth would surface. There had never been other passengers. No shared ride, no one else on the map. The route had been posted and left there, waiting. How long the driver had waited, how many empty miles he'd driven before this, would remain unanswered. The phone mounted on the dash glowed softly. Distance remaining. Long enough to pretend this was normal. The city began to thin. Stores with boarded windows, parking lots claimed by weeds, fences that enclosed nothing at all. 4 years gone and the world hadn't shifted an inch. It never did. Men like him passed through it like smoke, noticeable only for a moment, then gone, leaving no mark anyone could prove. Sunlight climbed higher, pressing down. The car drifted onto an exit he didn't recognize. He leaned forward. The driver lifted one finger from the wheel. Not warning, not reassurance. Just a pause suspended in the air as if to say, not yet. Or maybe it's already decided. The car rolled on. Factories slid past, low and windowless. Their walls stained in colors that suggested infection rather than paint. The driver's eyes met his in the mirror, flat, unreadable, like shallow water hiding depth by refusing reflection. Houses replaced warehouses, small ones, tired ones, yards trapped behind wire, cars resting on bricks like animals that had given up trying to stand. A creek cut through the area, choked with garbage and dark water that didn't move. Sweat gathered in his palms. He wiped them against his thighs and felt a tightening behind his ribs, a quiet pressure he hadn't known in years. Then it appeared. A gas station burned hollow. The canopy sagged over the pumps, collapsed inward like a spine that had failed under weight. Something inside him went cold. He knew this place. The fencing out back, bent just enough. The dumpster with one door always hanging open. Time peeled away. 5 years, maybe 6. The numbers blurred, but the memory did not. The car slowed. And for the first time since the ride began, the driver spoke, not with his mouth, but by turning the wheel, guiding them off the road, toward a place the past had never stopped waiting. He remembered her only in fragments at first, the The way kindness had slipped out of her without caution. The way she'd offered a ride because that's what decent people did. The mistake came later. It came when she noticed how he was looking at her and told him, gently but firmly, to get out of the car. He did, calm, obedient. And then night fell, and the world grew quieter, and he came back. Now the ruins drifted past the window like a half-buried confession. Charred concrete, rusted metal, weeds clawing through what used to be order. His own face hovered in the glass, pale and distorted, layered over the wreckage like a memory that refused to fade. The car slowed. His mouth went dry before he understood why. The driver eased into the lot and stopped. The engine stayed on, humming low, alive. Heat shimmered above the pavement. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver turned around. It was the first time their eyes met. The man's face looked carved by years, wind, sun, patience. But his eyes held something heavier, something exact. A weight the man in the back recognized instantly, because he'd worn it himself once back when he still thought he could carry it alone. The driver reached into the console and pulled out a folder, old, soft at the corners, open not for the first time. Photographs slid into view. Scenes marked by tape, evidence numbers, the cold language of aftermath. The driver raised the first photo. His hand shook just barely, like a nerve remembering pain. What remained of her face stared back, fire having erased anything gentle. The man in the back lunged for the door. It didn't move. He pulled again, harder, pain blooming across his palm. Locked, child-proofed, final. The driver didn't rush. He set the photograph down, face hidden, and lifted another. The station intact in this one, her car visible in the frame. A timestamp glowed in the corner, late night, precise to the minute. The man remembered the sky from that night. The way smoke blurred the stars but didn't hide them completely. Another photo joined the first. Then paperwork, official, typed, clinical. His name sat there in black ink, surrounded by charges that stopped just short of the truth. This one had never found him. The driver's jaw tightened. He picked up one last picture. A school portrait. She was younger than he'd thought. Younger than he'd wanted to know. Smiling in the uncomplicated way of someone who still believed the world mostly behaved. The driver folded his hands over the image. The engine ticked, heat pressed in. Silence stretched, heavy with numbers no one could escape, the simple arithmetic of harm and consequence. Without a word, the driver shifted the car back into gear and pulled onto the road. The ruined station shrank in the distance. The man's breathing came fast and shallow. His hands left dark smears on his jeans where sweat had soaked through. An hour passed, maybe more. The road narrowed until there was nothing on either side but scrub, wire fencing, and open land that didn't bother pretending it was safe. The driver slowed again, stopped on the shoulder, and pointed. At first, the man saw nothing. Then his eyes adjusted. A fence post, and beyond it, something waiting to be remembered. The driver's finger traced the air toward a subtle bend in the ground, the way the earth dipped just enough to hide what ran beneath it. A drainage tunnel, concrete throat under the road. The man in the back felt it lock into place before the driver said a word. He'd been here once already, years before the girl. Back then it had been a man promising honest labor for a day's pay. A man who talked too much, who hinted the money might come up short, who laughed in a way that suggested he believed leverage was on his side. A tire iron had ended that conversation. The body slid easily into the culvert. Water carried the rest. The truck went to a dismantler 2 towns over. $400 changed hands, clean enough, forgotten enough. Or so he thought. Another folder appeared. New paper, different weight. Inside, faces printed beneath the word missing. Photos of this very roadside, the fence post, the culvert's dark mouth. Proof that someone had noticed, that someone had searched. His stomach twisted. The driver opened a laptop resting on the seat beside him and angled it back. A video waited on the screen. When he pressed play, his breathing shifted, measured, restrained, like a man holding a door shut from the inside. A woman filled the frame, late 60s, sitting alone at a kitchen table worn smooth by decades of meals that no longer happened. She looked straight into the camera. The man in the back knew her instantly, though they had never crossed paths. Grief had shaped her features into something sharp and enduring. She spoke of her husband, the morning he'd left for work, the call that never came, the years spent imagining every possible ending because not knowing was worse than any certainty. The driver let it run, 2 minutes. Every second landed like weight. Then he closed the laptop, returned the folder to its place, put the car back in motion. That was when understanding finally settled in. This wasn't transportation. It was a ritual, a guided walk through buried ground, a reckoning mapped in miles. The ride-sharing app was theater. There had never been anyone else waiting to join. This journey had only ever had one passenger. He tugged at the door again, locked. He studied the driver's profile. The face hadn't shifted once. It might never shift again. This was a man who drove without urgency because urgency had lost meaning the night his daughter died in flames and concrete. Time had ended there. Everything since was excess. "I didn't kill your daughter," he said. The words barely made it past his teeth. Thin, fragile. "That wasn't me." No response. "I wasn't part of that, whatever you think." The driver's grip tightened. Tendons rose under the skin like pulled wire. The road continued to unspool. Another hour passed. They entered a town he knew too well. On the edge stood a factory where he'd lasted 3 weeks, long enough to learn routines, long enough to get caught searching cars after dark. The foreman had confronted him with a wrench, fury, and fear tangled together. The wrench had changed hands. He hadn't stopped when the man fell. The car rolled into the empty lot and stopped in the exact place where it had happened. The factory loomed hollow, windows blown out, walls holding nothing. On the concrete, a dark stain lingered, washed thin by time, but still there, still unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look. There was no mistaking it now. Each stop followed the same ritual, a new folder, a new set of lives laid bare. This one held images from a funeral. A woman in black, her face hollowed by shock. 2 children standing too straight beside a closed casket they were never allowed to see inside. The driver arranged the photographs carefully on the seat, one by one, as if assembling something sacred or damning. The man in the back curled his fingers into fists until his nails cut skin. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. A small recorder appeared. The driver pressed a button. A woman's voice filled the car. She spoke of the knock on the door before sunrise, of uniforms in her hallway, of words delivered gently that still shattered everything they touched. She described the sealed coffin, the years that followed, the quiet that never left her house. When her voice broke, the driver stopped the recording and put it away. Then they drove. and stopped again. A warehouse where a night guard had been left alive but unrecognizable to himself. A cluster of apartments where a knife had punctured a lung and rewritten a family's future. Each place came with proof, images, paperwork, voices, always voices, long enough to understand the damage, never long enough to escape it. The miles piled up. The landscape rolled past like a ledger. The driver never explained. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke in its own language. By late afternoon, the road signs stopped making sense. The highway felt unfamiliar. When the driver exited onto a narrow farm road, something inside the man tightened hard. This was wrong. Cornfields rose on both sides, dry and tall, rustling softly. This place didn't belong to his past. There was no memory waiting here. The car turned onto a dirt track, pushed forward until the corn closed around them and the road disappeared from view. Then it stopped. The engine cut. The driver stepped out, walked to the back, and opened the door. He moved away and stood still, hands empty, waiting. The open doorway gaped. After a moment, the man climbed out. His legs trembled as they met the ground. They faced each other across the dust. Insects droned in the stalks. The sun hovered low, red and heavy. The driver reached inside his jacket. The body moved before thought could intervene. Distance collapsed. Hands caught an arm. They went down together. The driver's head struck the earth with a dull sound. Something slipped free and landed nearby. Not metal. Paper. A photograph. Her again, the school portrait. The driver fought harder than expected. His fist cracked against the side of the man's head, bursting light across his vision. Instinct answered. A forearm pressed across a throat. Weight followed. The driver clawed at him. Gasps turned wet. The pressure increased. Something soft gave way beneath bone and muscle. Hands struck dirt, scraped, slowed. Stopped. He held on, counted silently, then released. The driver lay still, eyes open, staring up at a sky that offered nothing back. The man stood, shaking, breath tearing in and out of his chest. He looked down at the body, at the photograph half covered in dust. He bent and picked it up. The girl smiled up at him, unchanged. She smiled from the photograph as if nothing bad had ever learned her name. He flipped it over and felt the floor drop out of his body. Ink, careful handwriting, a name and a date that didn't belong to the night of the fire. Hannah, born April 3rd, 1992. His breath stalled. The girl at the station had been barely out of her teens. He remembered her license, laminated, curled at the edges before it melted. He remembered the name because he'd read it twice before feeding it to the flames. Rachel. Slowly, dreadfully, he turned toward the car, toward the folders scattered across the seat and dirt. He picked one up at random, then another, until he found the one from the station. He opened it again, this time without panic, without the need to escape the truth. The report was clear. A suspect, a trial, a conviction. Different name, different face, 3 years ago. His legs folded beneath him, and he hit the ground hard. The driver had known, or had needed not to know. He'd spent months building a case, tracing every step of violence the man had ever taken, but this one didn't belong there. His daughter's death was a separate cruelty, an unrelated horror. But grief doesn't respect accuracy. The driver had forced the story to fit, had driven himself into certainty because certainty was easier than emptiness. And now there was a new body cooling in the dirt, one that did belong to him. He stood and scanned the field. Corn pressed in on all sides, sealing them away. The engine still idled, patient. He could leave. He could disappear again. But plans like this never lived in one place. Someone would be waiting. Records would exist. Routes logged. Time stamped. His parole clock was already ticking. He walked back to the body. The old man's eyes were still open, fixed on nothing. He knelt and closed them gently, without ceremony, without anger. Stripped of purpose, the man looked smaller, just another father who had gambled everything on being right. He returned to the car and opened the remaining folder. This one was labeled Final. Inside were photographs of the field, satellite prints, hand-drawn maps, notes in red ink tracing routes and dates, outlining a slow tightening circle. It read like a case file prepared for court, except the verdict had always been meant to happen out here. At the bottom lay a journal. Handwritten, dense. Months of entries filled the pages, names, addresses, timelines, fragments of lives reduced to facts. The driver's certainty poured from every line, his patience, his resolve, his faith that if he arranged the truth carefully enough, justice would happen on its own. The man's hands were steady now. He returned to the body, searched the pockets, found the phone, brought it back, studied the maps again. The obsession, the care. He knew this part. Not the planning, he'd never planned like this. But what came after? The quiet work of correction, making a scene resolve into something people could accept. He'd learned early that intelligence mattered less than composure. That panic left fingerprints everywhere. That most people didn't actually look. They only confirmed what they already believed. He closed the folder. Outside, the corn whispered in the heat, and the road waited, empty and indifferent like it always had. Already believed. He moved with purpose now, calm settling over him like a practiced skill. He lifted the driver's body and placed it in the trunk, positioning it with care, the way someone does when they want things to look exactly as they should. He gathered every folder, every photograph, every scrap of paper and device and returned them to the car. Not randomly, deliberately. He rebuilt the story backward. An aging man consumed by grief, assembling proof, plotting revenge, losing control when the man he'd taken fought back. He pressed his own fingerprints where they belonged, on the jacket sleeve where he'd grabbed the driver's arm, on the folders where he'd searched frantically, desperate to prove he wasn't guilty of the one crime that mattered, on the recorder where he'd listened to the voices and realized too late what kind of man had taken him. The phone went back into the driver's pocket. The journal stayed in the car, open enough to invite reading. The maps and notes remained spread out like an altar to obsession. He checked the ride history on the app, every detour, every pause, every mile already logged, already telling the story for him. When it was finished, he walked into the corn and kept walking until the stalks released him back onto the road. A truck passed, he waved. The driver slowed, took in the prison-issued clothes, the dirt, the sweat, the look of someone who'd been through something he didn't want to explain. After a moment, the door opened. He was told to climb in. In the nearest town, he called the police. He told them about the driver who'd felt wrong from the start, about the detours, about the talking, about a daughter, about justice, about fixing things. His voice trembled when it needed to, broke when it should. He described the struggle in the field, the fall, the sudden stillness, how there had been no other choice. When officers found the car, they found everything exactly where it was supposed to be. A body, a trunk, a life's worth of notes and evidence pointing in one direction. The journal spoke loudly. The folders filled in gaps. The phone and app records traced a deliberate pattern. His fingerprints matched his account. Defensive marks matched his story. The driver's preparation looked unmistakable when laid out under fluorescent lights. They held him for weeks, asked the same questions in different rooms, brought in men who remembered his name from years ago, read every page the driver had written, but the conclusion never shifted. Grief had metastasized into fixation, fixation into action. The prosecutor reviewed it. The parole officer confirmed cooperation. The paper trail showed intent long before the ride ever began. In the end, the story held. And when he walked out again, into daylight, into traffic, into a world unchanged, he understood something with quiet certainty. The road doesn't care what you bury beneath it. It only remembers how to bring you back. The confrontation was ruled exactly how the paper said it should be. A plan conceived in grief, an abduction fueled by obsession, an ending no one intended but everyone could explain. The district attorney declined to move forward. Self-defense, clean enough to close the file. He understood how fragile that verdict was. One detective willing to linger, one prosecutor eager to prove something. The wrong question asked at the wrong moment could have torn the whole thing open. But the journal was exhausted, the preparation undeniable. The driver's sorrow fit neatly into motive, and motive made the rest feel reasonable. They wanted to believe it. They needed to believe that sometimes the system caught the right shape of truth. That violence could be contained inside a folder and label. He walked out of the station on a Tuesday morning. The sky above the steps was wide and empty, the same pale blue the driver had stared into at the end. He stood there longer than necessary, thinking of a girl named Hannah whose life had ended elsewhere, of a father who'd mistaken certainty for justice. He thought of a foreman, a night watchman, a body hidden beneath a road, of a girl at a gas station named Rachel, of how a single act rippled outward, shattering lives that would never touch again. He turned and headed for the bus depot. Westbound was all he asked for, as far as the cash in his sack would stretch. The ticket clerk didn't look up. The bus hissed, doors folded open, and he climbed aboard. As the town slipped away behind dirty glass, he recognized the pattern. Another place marked, another absence left behind. But this time the story wore a different face. This time he was the one who'd survived. He settled into the seat and closed his eyes. In the dark behind them, the driver's face surfaced, not angry, not violent, just stunned. The instant realization when truth arrived too late to be useful. Too late was always the timing. The road hummed beneath the bus. His hands rested in his lap, calm, unmoving. The man who had cataloged his sins was gone. His work reduced to exhibits, his obsession archived as grief taken too far. The authorities were satisfied. Justice, as defined by procedure, had been served. Not the justice the driver wanted, not the justice he deserved. Just the kind that fit the world as it was, where guilt depended on documentation, and truth bent toward whatever could be proven. He opened his eyes and watched the highway unwind toward the sun. He didn't imagine an end point, only distance, miles stacked between him and the field, between him and every stop on that long, deliberate ride. Around him, strangers slept or stared at phones or read paperback books. No one noticed him. No one searched his face for meaning. He was just another passenger moving through the country, his violence soaked up by the landscape like water into soil. Night fell, the bus kept going. He watched the darkness gather beyond the glass, and felt nothing at all. Story 2, Where the River Keeps Secrets. He had not been expecting anyone. The warning had come early, long before evening prayers carried in the sky itself. A sickly yellow-green light hung over the town, the kind that turned streets and houses into props on a stage, familiar but unreliable. Father Gring remembered that color from childhood, from storms that seemed to watch you back. By the time he finished his quiet meal, cold meat, stale bread, nothing worth lingering over, the rain had begun to strike the rectory windows with intent. Not a gentle fall, but sharp, repeated blows, as if something outside were testing how much the glass could bear. Since Cyprian stood apart from the house by a strip of neglected ground, years ago he'd planned to tend it, patch the fence, cut back the vines that had claimed the eastern wall. Tonight, crossing that short distance, it felt less like walking and more like wadding. Water sheeted down his back. His cassock clung to him like a second skin. The key sat in his pocket where it always had, carried there for more than 2 decades. Yet when he wrapped his fingers around it, something felt wrong. Heavier, colder, as if its shape had subtly changed when he wasn't looking. Inside, the darkness was not empty, it had weight. He did not turn on the lights right away, since Cyprian's had been built in the mid-19th century by a man who had buried his only child, and the building wore that sorrow openly. Windows too narrow and too numerous, columns that bore nothing, a ceiling painted with stars that time had nearly erased, leaving only pale suggestions against dull plaster. In daylight, the stained glass was gentle. At night, under storm clouds, it became something else entirely. Slick black panels that looked less like windows and more like openings into absence. That was when he noticed the smell. Not the expected mix of dust and incense, not the comforting decay of old wood and wax. This was deeper, colder, like air pulled from underground, like mud lifted from a riverbed and left to breathe. He stopped in the nave and inhaled again, cautious now. Perhaps a window had been left open. Perhaps the storm had dragged the scent of earth inside. But every window was sealed. He could tell even without the lights. And the smell was wrong for rain. There was salt in it. He moved toward the confessional. The church held 2. One near the altar had been closed long before his arrival, supposedly damaged beyond safe use. He had never questioned that explanation. The other stood in the southwest corner, its dark wood looming even in shadow. It was an extravagant thing, heavy with carvings whose meanings had never been fully explained to him. Birds with women's faces, branches bearing eye-shaped fruit, hands everywhere, praying, grasping, or simply holding on. On the priest's side, the air smelled older, familiar again. Wax, dust, time. He sat, adjusted his collar, and waited. Rain drummed harder against the roof. For a moment, he thought he was alone. Then the screen opposite him shifted, just slightly, as if someone had settled their weight against it. And Father Gring understood, without yet knowing why, that whatever had come through the storm had not arrived to be forgiven. Father Gring felt the familiar contour of the confessional pressing against him, worn smooth over decades, and a deep exhaustion settled into his bones. 71 years as of last April. When had that slipped past him? Time had become strange, stretching and contracting like the storm outside, bending reality without permission. He had not intended to drift into sleep, yet the darkness held him, and the patter of rain against the roof lent a peculiar privacy. Then came the knock, 3 sharp, insistent raps against the confessional door. The sound startled him awake, neck stiff. left arm numb below the elbow. He cleared his throat and sat up straighter. The door opened and closed. Through the fine lattice of wood, nearly transparent in its craftsmanship, he could barely discern a shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, a vague outline of someone present. He could not tell if they wore a coat or a different garment. The silence stretched unnatural. He had grown accustomed to quiet while seated in confession. People often took time to summon courage, but this felt different. It was not hesitation, it was waiting, waiting for him to grasp something he did not yet understand. A sudden chill ran up his legs. His feet felt submerged in cold water, though he could see nothing beyond the worn floorboards, dry as ever. Yet the dampness crept along his ankles, seeping through his shoes. He shifted slightly. His socks squelched faintly, though they had been bone dry when he entered the booth. Finally the voice came, soft, laced with an accent he could not place, not local. The words came deliberately, as if translated or forced through injury. "I need to tell you about my mother," the man said. Father Gring, who had heard a lifetime of confessions, infidelities, petty thefts, endless variations on human weakness, felt something constrict within him. Not his heart exactly, but an adjacent organ he did not know existed, contracting sharply as if discovering itself only in this instant. The numbness in his arm began to fade, replaced by pins and needles, crawling beneath the skin like tiny insects. The man's name was Oswald. He had never liked it. His mother had chosen it from a novel during her confinement, a detail she had repeated endlessly throughout his childhood, as though reminding him of the gift of his own existence required constant acknowledgement. He discovered the book years later, buried in a box of his mother's belongings. The cover was faded, the pages yellowed, and the story inside chronicled the meticulous crimes of a Victorian poisoner. She never mentioned it. Perhaps she had forgotten, or perhaps she had chosen to forget, like so many other things she had carefully buried. The house where Oswald had spent his childhood still stood on Mercy Street. A narrow two-story painted the dull, jaundiced color of old teeth. Number 47. Its front garden had been dominated by a single tree, planted by his father the year before he vanished. Oswald was 9 when his father went out for cigarettes and never returned. A month later, a postcard arrived from Ontario. No address, no message, just a hurried signature, possibly forged. In the weeks that followed, his mother clung to routine as if it were armor. She cooked meals she never ate, listened to the radio with an intensity that suggested she heard nothing at all. Then, one morning, she didn't rise. She told him she was well. The next day, the same. By the end of the week, she instructed him to bring her food on a tray. That was 1962. Oswald had barely emerged from adolescence, finishing his studies at the technical college. There had been a girl named Maureen at the chemist's shop, her smile hinting at possibilities he didn't yet have words for. But his mother demanded attention. Her illness had no name, no diagnosis. Doctors were a luxury, she said. All she needed was rest and her devoted son to care for her. Oswald was her good son, her Oswald. The first year wasn't entirely unpleasant. He found small bookkeeping work he could do from home. His mother's requests were simple: toast and weak tea in the morning, a thin soup at midday, something heavier at night that she rarely finished. He read to her from the newspaper. She had opinions, loud, contradictory, insistent, about everything: the state of the roads, the character of politicians, the scandalous length of women's skirts. Oswald learned quickly not to contradict her. By the third year, Maureen had married someone else. He had seen the announcement in the paper while preparing to read aloud to his mother, and for the first time, the weight of his life pressed down on him with the quiet, unyielding force of inevitability. He stayed with his mother, day after day, meal after meal, opinion after opinion, as the outside world slipped quietly past the windows of number 47. He learned the contours of her illness, the rhythm of her moods, the secret places where grief had settled. He learned that devotion could be its own kind of prison, and he learned slowly that some absences could never be filled, not by letters, not by postcards, not even by his presence. The book he found later was only the first crack in that understanding, the first whisper that what was buried in memory had a way of rising again. He had stopped questioning the reasons long ago, tearing out that page before he began, leaving the memory folded away where it would not disturb him. His mother never noticed. By then, she rarely left her bed, a soft fortress of blankets and pillows, while doctors, one timid young man who seemed unnerved by the house itself, could find nothing physically wrong. Perhaps she was bedridden by choice. Perhaps her mind had quietly withdrawn. There were facilities, options, suggestions offered delicately, but Oswald dismissed them all. She needed him, and she said so every single day. Her voice threaded through the house like an unyielding rhythm. "Good morning, Oswald. Have you brought my tea? Oswald, these sheets must be changed. Oswald, read me something bright. I cannot bear any more gloomy news. You're a good son, aren't you? You won't leave me as your father did." And he did not. He had never left. The house carried a smell, stubborn and close, something heavy and lingering no open window could chase away. Neighbors stopped calling after the first half-decade. Postmen abandoned knocking, leaving parcels on the step. Oswald shopped before sunrise when streets were empty, racing back within the hour, knowing her anxiety would swell if he lingered too long. Sometimes, he could hear her calling for him before he even turned the key. 15 years. 15 years of care, though the word had grown hollow, reshaped into something unrecognizable. The routines became mechanical. Trays delivered, bedpans emptied, curtains opened and closed at their appointed hours. Conversations followed an invisible script. He knew what she would say before she said it, and often, when alone, he found himself speaking her responses aloud in the kitchen, perfecting the inflection, the rhythm, the tiny emphases that made her voice hers. When she died, and she must have, though at first Oswald could not tell if the silence was hers or simply the absence of hearing, he did not immediately perceive a shift. The routines persisted. He still carried the trays, read the newspaper aloud, adjusted the curtains with the rising and setting of the sun. The quiet had crept in slowly. Her voice had faded into him, woven into his own gestures, his own cadence. Her withdrawal had seemed natural, inevitable, the final privacy of a woman retreating into herself. It was Mrs. Henley from next door who finally intervened. Oswald had been at the greengrocer, hands full of vegetables and bread, when she appeared, eyes sharp beneath her bonnet, speaking with that decisive clarity that only a neighbor who had watched long enough could summon. Something had shifted in Oswald's life, though he could not yet name it, a fracture, a breach of the order he had maintained for so long. And it was in that fracture that the first whisper of the world beyond his mother's bed began to reach him again. She leaned in with practiced concern, asking how he was coping now that his mother was gone. She mentioned the funeral, said she'd heard it was very small, and apologized for not attending. The news had reached her too late, she explained. Oswald only stared at her. In his wire basket sat a single cabbage and a tin of soup, the kind his mother preferred, though she complained recently that it didn't taste the same anymore. Something in his expression must have unsettled Mrs. Henley. She made a small, helpless sound and briefly touched his arm, then stepped back as if she'd crossed an invisible line. That evening she returned with the local cleric. Together, they went upstairs. They found his mother in the same bed where she had remained for 15 years. The official report later avoided plain language, wrapping itself in careful terminology, but one truth cut through everything else. The body had been dead for a very long time, more than a decade. The details blurred into words Oswald couldn't hold on to, phrases that slid away as soon as he tried to grasp them. What stayed with him was the cleric's face. The man was young, barely into adulthood, his beard uneven, as if he were still deciding who he wanted to be. He went upstairs first and stayed there longer than expected. When he finally came back down, his complexion had taken on a sickly hue, like the sky before heavy rain. He asked to use the telephone. He asked Oswald to remain in the kitchen. He asked questions slowly, evenly, with the careful tone one uses when afraid of saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment. The days that followed filled with unfamiliar people and unfamiliar authority, officers, doctors who did not introduce themselves as healers. Papers appeared that required signatures. Oswald tried to explain. His mother had still needed him. She had spoken to him. Not every day toward the end, perhaps, but often enough. Enough for him to know she was aware, that she listened, that she approved of the way he cared for her. They listened politely. Pens moved across pages. One woman, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, asked a question that made no sense to him at all. If his mother had been dead for 10 years, she asked, who exactly had been speaking? Oswald could not answer because the question itself was wrong. It misunderstood everything. His mother had spoken. He had heard her. The condition of her body did not erase the reality of those conversations. They pressed him to be specific. Dates, exact words, moments he could isolate and hand over like evidence. Oswald searched his memory, but the voice had never arrived in neat sentences. It had been woven into his days, into his movements, into the air of the house itself. How could he separate it out now, when it had always been everywhere? The truth hit him all at once, sharp enough to make the room tilt. The voice he'd been hearing for years wasn't hers anymore. Maybe it never had been. The pauses, the rhythm, the familiar turns of phrase, they matched his own. Somewhere along the way, the conversation had collapsed into a single speaker. He'd been answering himself, carrying both sides, keeping the sound alive because silence felt worse. The doctors waited for panic, for grief, for a breakdown. It didn't come. What hollowed him out was something quieter, heavier. If the voice had been his, then his mother had spent 10 full years alone in that upstairs room. No warmth, no reply, just darkness and stillness while he stood downstairs believing he was doing enough. The care he'd been so proud of hadn't saved her from abandonment. Inside the confessional, Father Gring felt his body refuse him. Muscles locked, breath thin. The narrow space seemed to demand stillness, as if any movement might tear something fragile open. The man behind the screen stopped speaking, waiting. The priest knew he was supposed to respond, to comfort, to absolve, to say something holy or at least humane, but his throat sealed around the words. A question slipped out instead, uninvited. What became of you after that? The answer came evenly. Hospitals first, then somewhere smaller, quieter, eventually freedom with conditions attached, pills, appointments, rules. He followed them all. He was very good at following instructions. The way he said was made the word linger unfinished. He wasn't there for forgiveness, the man added. His tone flattened, emptied of appeal. Some things don't deserve pardon. He only needed someone to know about his mother, to know how long she waited, how long she was left unheard. Father Gring's mouth felt like chalk. Questions crowded his mind, about medication, about compliance, about danger, but they suddenly felt meaningless, like shouting directions after someone had already fallen. Before he could speak again, the door on the other side creaked open, then shut. Footsteps moved away across stone. The main doors groaned wide. Wind and rain burst in, then vanished as the doors closed once more. Father Gring sat alone in the confessional. The familiar scent of old wood and incense lingered, but beneath it now was something damp and close, like a room long sealed, like water trapped where it shouldn't be. He stepped out of the confessional as if the floor no longer fully agreed with him. His knees trembled. The church stood hollow and vacant, exactly as it should. Rain hammered the roof. No one sane would be abroad in a storm like this. He told himself to go back to the rectory, boil water, steady his hands around a cup, swallow something for the dull pressure blooming behind his eye. Then the sound came. 3 precise knocks, firm, intentional. Not from the main doors. From the other booths. The unused one. Father Gring had always believed that most things could be explained if you waited long enough. This sound refused that courtesy. Someone was inside a space that had not been opened in decades. He tried reason anyway, perhaps a forgotten side entrance, perhaps his memory failing him. But another thought pressed harder, colder. The man hadn't left. He had only moved. Each step toward the second confessional felt heavier than the last. The shadows clung to it differently. The carvings seemed deeper, more crowded, as though the wood had grown busier while no one was watching. Faces within feathers, fruit that sagged and shone like wet eyes. The priest's door creaked open. The bench inside did not welcome him. It rejected his weight, foreign to his body. The air here was wrong, cool, wet, mineral, like a place beneath the earth where water waited patiently. Behind the screen sat a shape smaller than before, condensed, listening. Silence stretched thin. Then a young woman spoke. Her voice carried the clarity of someone long past fear. She told him she needed to talk about the accident, the one she didn't live through. Her name, she said, was Catherine, though most people had shortened it to Kath. She described the road with unnecessary precision, the direction of travel, the day of the week, the slanted gold of October light that turns ordinary moments into something already nostalgic. She had been driving to see her sister, not eagerly. There was a man involved now, a man who talked too much about plans and futures Catherine didn't feel part of. Still, obligation has weight, and she had obeyed it. She left straight from work with a half-warm coffee and a packet of crisps rattling on the passenger seat. As she spoke, Father Gring understood, without being told, that the story would not stop at the impact, that she had come to describe not how it ended, but how it continued. Traffic had been dense but orderly, the kind of afternoon where nothing feels dangerous because everything behaves as expected. Catherine kept to the center lane, speed steady, hands relaxed on the wheel. A calm voice drifted from the radio, explaining distant stars and ancient instruments, and she remembers thinking, oddly, tenderly, of her father bent over his telescope before his hands betrayed him. She never saw the reason the vehicle ahead of her stopped. Later, she tried to assemble the moment like broken glass laid on a table, but pieces were missing. The large truck in front of her halted as if the road itself had commanded it. Catherine braked hard. The pedal shuddered beneath her foot. There was a brief, absurd sense of relief. This might work, she thought. Then something struck her from behind. The impact folded time. Her car lurched forward, crushed beneath steel. There was a ripping sound, violent and intimate, followed by a thinner noise she would later suspect was herself. And then the world lost a frequency. Not silence exactly, more like the removal of everything that proves you're still here. She opened her eyes to white, or what passed for white, walls too clean, light that hummed, a smell sharp enough to scrape the inside of her nose. Someone told her she was fortunate, told her the wreckage was unrecognizable, but she'd escaped with little more than bruises and a ringing head. Her sister had been called. She could leave by evening. Catherine didn't argue. The place made her uneasy in ways she couldn't explain. The brightness felt uneven, pooling strangely in corners. The other patients lay too still, and there were mirrors everywhere, corridors, rooms, doors, catching her reflection at angles that made her heart skip for no clear reason. Home should have fixed that. It didn't. Her flat greeted her like a photograph taken just before disaster. Dirty dishes waited in the sink. The bed remembered her shape. A cardigan slumped over a chair as if someone had just stood up and vanished. Yet the air felt heavier, charged. Sounds lingered too long. Footsteps echoed when she hadn't moved. That was when she saw it. In the bathroom mirror, just behind her shoulder. A figure close, familiar in outline. She spun around at once. Nothing stood there. Only tiles, towels, the ordinary clutter of her life. Her reflection stared back at her, breathing a little too fast, eyes searching the room for a mistake. But the mirror had already told the truth. The towel lay crumpled on the tiles. Her toothbrush stood exactly where she'd left it. When Catherine forced herself to look again, the shape was still there in the glass. Narrow, motionless, its face refusing to resolve no matter how hard she stared. It wasn't hostile. That was the worst part. It felt incidental, like a margin note scribbled beside her existence. She skipped brushing her teeth, went straight to bed, killed the lights, pulled the covers up and waited for sleep that barely arrived. When it did, it came apart easily. She kept waking with the certainty of someone standing beside the mattress, close enough that their breathing matched her own. Morning brought excuses. Concussion, she told herself. The doctor had warned her. Light sensitivity, confusion, visual artifacts. She booked a follow-up and tried to behave like nothing had changed. But the mirrors disagreed. The shape appeared in shop windows as she passed, in the black screen of her television, in polished metal, in glass doors, in any surface that could betray her reflection, always behind her, always the same measured distance, as if geometry mattered more than intention. She could never quite see its face, only a suggestion of sharpness, of something stretched thinner than it should be. Catherine began to adapt. A towel draped over the bathroom mirror. Her desk shifted so she wouldn't catch the window's glare. Her phone stayed face down unless absolutely necessary. She learned to navigate rooms without looking up. When her sister called, Catherine answered carefully, vaguely. There was no language for this. How do you explain that every reflection has learned to lie? The thing never advanced. That constancy gnawed at her more than pursuit would have. Once, out of desperation, she tested it, walking backward toward a shop front, watching her own image close the gap. Just before contact, the figure dissolved, gone, leaving only her face, pale and frightened, staring back alone. 3 weeks after the crash, she stopped going to work. First, she called in sick. Then she stopped calling at all. Messages piled up. Rent notices appeared on the door. Her sister's voice grew tight with worry. Catherine ignored it all. Because by then, a thought had settled in her mind. Cold, immovable, and horrifyingly precise. The figure wasn't following her. It was waiting for her to realize she never left the road at all. She finally understood the truth, and it was worse than fear. The presence wasn't chasing her. It wasn't hunting. It was correcting an error. The thing in the glass was Catherine, the version that should have been erased when steel folded and momentum finished its work. The one who belonged to the silence beneath twisted metal. The woman still walking through shops and flats and bus stops was the anomaly, a remainder, a misfiled entry. Something had gone wrong. She returned to the motorway as if drawn by a quiet summons. 3 buses, a long walk. She recognized the place immediately, not by signs or markers, but by the way her chest tightened when she stood there. No flowers, no roadside cross, no pause in traffic, just asphalt already rewritten by thousands of tires as if nothing had ever happened. She waited for revelation, for memory, for pain. Instead, a parked car betrayed her. In its darkened window, her reflection appeared, and behind it, closer than ever, the other Catherine. Close enough that the details sharpened. Close enough that Catherine saw lips moving, shaping words she couldn't hear. A hand lifted, finger extended, not accusing exactly, not pleading either, claiming. That was the moment it clicked. She had taken a life that wasn't hers anymore. The real Catherine, the one meant to breathe and age and visit her sister, was trapped on the wrong side of the glass, pressing against reflections, trying to reclaim what had been stolen by chance. And Catherine, the walking mistake, was in the way. Stopping eating felt merciful, a correction. If she was only residue, her body didn't need fuel. Sleep followed the same logic. Then movement, then light, curtains drawn, stillness embraced. She sat in the dark, barely breathing, offering vacancy to the one who deserved it. She was making space. Her sister broke in eventually. Catherine remembered the sound of splintering wood, the shock of hands on her shoulders, the brightness that hurt her eyes. She remembered voices asking questions built on the wrong assumption, that she was real, that she belonged. She didn't answer. There was nothing to explain. They took her somewhere clean and loud. People with calm voices named things they believed explained her. They spoke of trauma, of fractured identity, of the mind protecting itself too well. They offered pills that dulled the edges, slowed the certainty, made her thoughts heavy enough to sink. They promised healing. Catherine listened politely. She always did. But knowledge doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient. The last mirror she was allowed to see was in a tiled bathroom at the facility. A small mercy, they said, because she'd been cooperative. She stood at the sink, bracing herself, and looked up. For the first time, there was no one behind her. The glass showed only one woman. Catherine stared, heart-pounding, waiting for the familiar wrongness. Seconds passed. Nothing emerged. No shadow, no echo, no correction. She didn't feel relief. She felt dread. Because if the reflection was empty now, it meant the other Catherine had stopped waiting. And somewhere, she didn't know where, the real one had finally found another way through. She stared at the glass for 10 full minutes, counting breaths, waiting for the correction to return. Nothing shifted. Nothing blinked. The mirror held only one woman, drawn, colorless, undeniably present. That was when the truth settled in. The rightful Catherine had stopped fighting. The one who belonged to this life had surrendered, leaving the mistake to continue on her behalf, to work, to speak, to occupy space she no longer deserved. That understanding crushed her harder than the crash ever had. Fear had been easier. Even madness would have been easier. This was guilt without escape. Across the church, Father Gring sat frozen in the confessional, aware only dimly that his breathing had gone wrong. Too shallow, too fast. The woman's voice had fallen silent at some point, but the silence she left behind was dense, almost physical, pressing against his ears and chest. He knew he was supposed to respond. He was a priest. Words were his trade. Forgiveness, guidance, blessing. These were tools he'd carried for decades. Yet nothing in his training addressed this. No seminary lecture prepared him for a confession that ended with the quiet certainty of being already dead. Then the penitent's door opened. Footsteps crossed the stone floor, light as hesitation. The great doors at the front of the church groaned open, let in wind and rain, then closed again. Father Gring was alone. He stayed seated long after the ache in his legs turned sharp. The storm battered the building with steady insistence. Water rattled the windows. Air moved through the church's hidden gaps with a sound too much like lungs filling and emptying. He told himself what he had always believed, that death was a passage, not a detour, that souls did not wander, that faith was not folklore. The dead did not linger in reflections or recount motorway accidents behind lattice screens. And yet, 3 knocks, close, immediate, not from the other booth, from his own door. The sound came from inside the church, asking to enter the space where he already sat. His hand reached for the latch before his mind could object. The wood felt strangely warm beneath his fingers, or perhaps his skin had gone cold enough to make it seem so. He opened the door. The nave was no longer empty. A figure stood a few yards away, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for permission to exist. Its outline wavered in the half-light, neither solid nor insubstantial, familiar and wrong all at once. Father Gring swallowed, every certainty he had ever held shifting under his feet. And somewhere in the church, unseen but unmistakable, a mirror caught the light. The figure stood near the altar, cut into silhouette by windows blackened with rain. As Father Gring's vision settled, the shape resolved into a man, tall, narrow, wrapped in clothing that suggested formality without certainty. A suit, perhaps, or the memory of one. The man faced the crucifix. His head leaned at an angle that felt wrong, not quite reverent, not quite broken. Father Gring moved closer, each step loud in the hollow church. The sound of his shoes seemed intrusive, almost rude. The man did not turn. Up close, the clothes revealed their age. The cut belonged to another decade, another rhythm of life. Heavy fabric, practical in theory, uncomfortable in practice. Clothing chosen to endure, not to move. When the man finally turned, Father Gring's breath caught. Nothing was overtly damaged. No wounds, no rot, just misalignment. The face did not agree with itself. One eye sat too high, or perhaps the mouth leaned when it shouldn't. The longer Father Gring looked, the less certain he became of what was wrong, only that something fundamental had slipped. For the briefest instant, so fast he almost blamed his eyes, he saw water spilling from the man's collar, soaking the front of the suit in a steady, impossible stream. Then he blinked. The fabric was pristine, dry, sharply pressed. The man said he had been waiting, that it was almost time. Time for what? Father Gring asked. The man did not answer. He turned and began walking toward the entrance, unhurried but unmistakably purposeful. Father Gring followed, though the decision felt made somewhere below thought. They passed the pews worn smooth by generations, the carved stations. The baptismal font left dry too long, its silence another small failure Father Gring had been postponing. At the door the man stopped. He placed his palm flat against the wood, did not open it, simply rested there as if listening through it. He asked how many there were. How many what? Father Gring said. How many dead this place holds? The question made no sense. Buildings did not count. Stone did not remember. Yet his mind betrayed him, filling with images he had not summoned. The ledgers kept in the rectory, names written carefully year after year, baptisms, weddings, burials, ink fading as generations passed. Outside, the graveyard pressed tight against itself, plots reused, bodies layered beneath markers worn smooth by rain. The man nodded, as though Father Gring had answered. He removed his hand from the door, and the church inhaled. A lone figure stood near the altar, carved into shadow by the blackened windows behind him. As Father Gring let his eyes settle, the shape resolved into a man, tall, spare, dressed in something that resembled formal wear from another era. Not quite a suit, not quite ceremonial. He faced the crucifix, his head angled unnaturally, as if caught between reverence and ruin. The priest moved closer. Each step rang too loudly in the hollow church. The man did not turn. Up close, the clothing revealed itself as strangely dated, the cut unmistakably old, the fabric thick and unforgiving. The sort of wool meant for a world that no longer existed. When the man finally turned, Father Gring felt his certainty loosen. The face wasn't grotesque, not exactly, but it refused to settle into coherence. An eye sat wrong, or the mouth, or perhaps nothing was wrong at all and the fault lay in the watching. For the briefest instant, Father Gring was sure water spilled from beneath the man's collar, darkening the cloth in steady rivulets. He blinked. The fabric was pristine, sharply pressed, untouched. "I've been waiting," the man said. "For what?" Father Gring asked. But the man had already turned away, walking toward the front doors with deliberate calm. Not hurried, certain. Against his will, Father Gring followed. They passed the pews, the stations of the cross, the baptismal font, dry for months, its repair postponed for reasons Father Gring could no longer fully remember. The man stopped at the doors and pressed his palm flat against the wood, as if listening through it. "How many?" he asked. "How many dead does this place carry?" The question made no sense. Churches did not carry memories. They were stone and timber, consecrated but inert. And yet Father Gring thought of the ledger's ink names stretching back to the mid-1800s. Baptisms, weddings, burials. The cemetery outside, so crowded that the markers leaned together like exhausted companions. "Many," he said at last. The man nodded, unsurprised. "They must speak," he said, "before the reckoning." Then he opened the door. Wind tore inside, heavy with rain and soil. "The final one is coming," the man said. "After that, you'll understand." He stepped into the storm and vanished. No retreating footsteps, no fading silhouette, just absence. Father Gring stood frozen as rain lashed his face. Beyond the doorway there was nothing. No street, no town, no world. Only darkness. He shut the door. Silence crushed the space. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Then 3 sharp knocks. Not on the door. On the confessional nearest the altar. The one sealed years ago, officially for decay. Unofficially, for reasons no one had ever spoken aloud. Father Gring crossed the nave on legs that felt borrowed. Distance warped beneath his steps. Near became far, far became irrelevant. The confessional swelled before him, its carvings twisting in the dim light. The winged women etched into the wood were no longer still. Their mouths gaped. The trees beneath them wept. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth, copper, and a sweetness that turned the stomach. The bench welcomed him too well, molded to his body as if in anticipation. Through the screen sat another figure, larger than the last. Wide shoulders, the posture of someone who had carried weight for a lifetime. The figure remained silent. Father Gring waited. Time thickened, and somewhere deep within the church, something listened. He couldn't have measured the time. Minutes felt identical to hours. The storm beyond the walls seemed to surge again, or perhaps it had never eased, or perhaps the idea of an outside had quietly ceased to exist. There was only the confessional now, only the thick, living dark breathing softly beyond the screen. When the voice finally spoke, recognition struck him like a blow. Not because he remembered hearing it before, but because some part of him had been waiting for it since childhood, as if this sound had been promised long ago and delayed only out of cruelty. It asked about the bus, the one that left the road near Glasson Dock. Father Gring's body betrayed him, his throat locked, his limbs refused instruction. Thought itself collapsed into a single roaring pressure behind his ears, whether blood or something else he could not tell. 40 years ago, the voice said calmly. November, a Tuesday, rain like this. Images tore loose. 23 passengers, pilgrims, returning from Lancaster. Hymns filling the bus, voices lifted in tired devotion, right up until the instant another vehicle crossed where it never should have been. The sound inside Father Gring's head became deafening. Somewhere far below his awareness, his heart faltered. His lungs forgot their work, and yet his mind drifted upward, detached, hovering like an observer who had paid to watch someone else's execution. 97 miles an hour, the voice continued. The other car, the driver was drunk, 29, drinking since late afternoon. Details he had buried clawed their way free. A bartender's hand on his wrist, keys withheld, words exchanged, an insistence that bordered on anger, a need to go home, something important the next morning, always something important. Father Gring tried to speak, to correct the record, to explain that it hadn't been that simple, that he hadn't meant harm, that it was only 3 drinks, or 4, that youth was foolish but not cruel. But language had been stripped from him. Words dissolved before reaching his tongue. The bus broke through the barrier, the voice said, straight into the estuary. Cold flooded the memory, the kind of cold that steals breath instantly. High tide, black water, the impact alone might not have killed them all. Some lived long enough to know, the voice went on, long enough to feel the water rise, long enough to wonder. The question came gently. Had he ever considered what they thought in those final moments, whether fear arrived first or prayer, whether anyone called for help that never came? The figure shifted. Through the screen, more details resolved. An overcoat soaked beyond reason, water streaming endlessly yet never pooling. Droplets fell upward as often as down, defying any law Father Gring had once believed sacred. A hand rested on a knee. The fingers were elongated, the joints bending where joints had no right to bend. The voice softened. The driver, it said, survived. Silence followed, thick, expectant, merciless. The other car survived, the voice whispered, calm, unflinching. Minor injuries, a broken collarbone, a few cuts. The driver was taken to the hospital, patched up, released. Father Gring felt a shiver crawl down his spine. And the investigation, he croaked. Of course, the figure said, but it led nowhere. The other driver vanished into the night, somehow navigating a car that should have been wrecked beyond repair. Home, garage, woke the next morning remembering nothing. Convenient, isn't it? How the mind protects itself. Water had begun dripping from the figure's coat, dark and thick, pooling at Father Gring's feet. The smell hit him, mud from the estuary, diesel, and something iron-rich, sharp. Blood or a shadow of it. Something that belonged to drowning. There were witnesses, the voice continued. A fragment of a license plate, but nothing came of it. The files went in circles for months before the case was quietly closed, unsolved. The families received what remained, funerals, 23 in a single week. Newspapers ran the story for 3 days. Then it vanished, swallowed by the next tragedy, the next headline. Father Gring's tongue loosened. Words forced themselves out, strange even to him. I don't remember. The figures had tilted. You do. The priest shook, memories clawing back unbidden. November, a Tuesday 40 years ago. The pub, the King's Arms. A woman, Margaret something, her laugh brittle, trying to hide amusement. Drinks bought, one after another, more for courage than charm. She left. He stayed. To leave would have been surrender, a concession he couldn't grant. The night resurfaced like debris floating on a dark river. The bartender's wary glance. The rain hammering against the windows. The certainty that he could drive. That he knew every twist and pothole of the 2 miles to his flat like the lines of his own hand. You hit them at Candor Green Road, the voice said, unyielding, numbing the junction like a verdict. The bus had no chance. Father Gring's stomach turned. The car, what was it? He whispered. Green, the figure said, Vauxhall Cavalier. Dent on the left door, scratches on the bumper. Every detail you thought forgotten is still here. Every wrong turn, every reckless choice remembered. The water spread wider now, darkening the confessional floor, curling around his shoes. He could smell it, feel it pressing at his feet, an invisible tide of memory and consequence. Do you see it now? The figure asked. All the lives you overlooked, all the prayers you ignored, all the moments that mattered swept away by your certainty, your arrogance, your blind hands on the wheel. Father Gring sank lower onto the bench. The storm outside had become irrelevant. Every drop of rain, every gust of wind, shrunk to the sound of one man confronting the unalterable truth of what had been done. The confessional seemed smaller, alive, watching. The water continued to spread, and the figure waited, patient, inexorable, as though the night itself had paused for this reckoning. The rear bumper, scratched from a minor collision the week before, had been the first thing he noticed. The front left wheel had clipped something else, nothing that should have mattered. The bus, top-heavy, slick from the rain, had crumpled through the barrier like tissue. Father Gring's hands trembled. He pressed them to his chest, feeling his heart stutter in a rhythm that was not his own, a chaos of guilt and disbelief. And then he had driven away. Not immediately. For 30 seconds he had sat, gripping the wheel, watching the bus settle into the water, headlights still glowing, faint movements inside. And then he reversed, and the road behind swallowed him. His voice faltered, evaporated against the confessional's thick, damp air. The memory pressed in. He had parked at home, glanced at the damage, bonnet crumpled, headlights shattered, streaks of paint that were not his own, and convinced himself of a story. A deer, or a fence post. The rain, fatigue, misjudgment. Regrettable, yes, but not criminal. The water at his feet had risen now, icy and real, licking through the leather of his shoes. He should have stood, run, fled the church forever, but his body refused. He remained, frozen by some deeper necessity, drawn to hear the remainder of the confession. Within a week he told himself it had never happened. News reports about the bus. He read them, noted the tragedy, and then folded them away from himself. None of it mattered. How could it? He had hit a deer. The Cavalier had been damaged by a deer. By the time he sold the car for scrap 3 months later, he had fully convinced himself. Absolutely. Father Gring's mind wanted to argue, to insist memory could not be so easily rewritten, that the human brain did not abandon truth with such precision. But he knew better. Theology had taught him the soul's resilience, its capacity for self-preservation, its willingness to craft false narratives. Faith, he realized, demanded a quiet collaboration with fiction. And then the voice said he had found God, or at least convinced himself he had. The accident he had forgotten, the one that had never happened, became the pivot around which his life spun. He entered the seminary, older than his peers at 32, and embraced the rituals, the prayers, the absolution, as though penance could rewrite reality. Yet here, in the confessional, with the water rising and the figure waiting beyond the screen, he understood the truth he had buried. No ritual, no devotion, no carefully constructed lie could erase the bodies in the river, the eyes of the living and the dead alike, the silent accusation that pressed against him in the darkness. The storm outside had become irrelevant. Nothing mattered except the presence on the other side of the screen, patient and unyielding, demanding the reckoning that 40 years of denial could not deny. Move not really. The cold had climbed past his knees, biting into his flesh, sinking into his bones. Every step felt like wadding through molten lead. And still, the figure advanced, slow, deliberate, each movement impossibly precise, as though time itself had bent to its will. Through the screen, Father Gring could now see the man's eyes, empty yet full, a void and a storm at once. They were eyes that had watched the water rise, had counted the bodies as they were swallowed, had registered the terror and disbelief of 23 lives extinguished in seconds. And now they were fixed on him, on his failure, on the lies he had told himself for 40 years. "You've been confessing all this time," the voice said, low and resonant, "to the living, to the innocent, to yourself. But you've never confessed to us. We waited." Father Gring's breath came in ragged gasps. The water crept higher, swirling around his thighs. He wanted to speak, to beg for forgiveness, but his voice had evaporated long before. The figure leaned closer, and the scent of mud, diesel, and something older, something eternal, filled the confessional, clinging to him like a second skin. "They weren't yours to save," the figure said. "They never asked you to save them, but they waited for the only absolution you could give, the truth. And now it is too late." Father Gring's hands clawed at the wooden screen, the familiar barrier between penitent and priest, but it offered no shelter. The walls of the confessional seemed to pulse, contracting and expanding, as if the memories of every lost soul pressed against them, demanding recognition. Each breath was a battle, each heartbeat a confession he could no longer control. I tried," he whispered finally, though the words felt meaningless, swallowed by the water that had risen to his waist. "I tried to." "You failed," the voice finished for him. "And yet you remain. You think your life is penance. It is only the shadow of it. Only now do you understand what it was you ran from." The figure paused, as if granting him a final glance, and then it began to fade, not backward but upward, dissolving like smoke caught in a shaft of stormlight, leaving behind only the dark water, the echo of that terrible gaze, and a silence so heavy it pressed against every inch of his body. Father Gring sank to his knees in the ankle-deep remains, trembling, soaked, utterly alone. The storm outside raged, but inside the church, nothing moved. Not a candle flickered. Not a sound interrupted the weight of understanding that had finally settled over him. The confessional, the water, the rising guilt, they had converged into a single, terrible truth. He had spent 40 years trying to absolve himself, but some sins, Some sins do not dissolve in prayer. Some confessions wait, and they wait forever. Absolute silence, their eyes fixed, unblinking, unyielding. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cold river water, and something older, something that tasted of inevitability. Every step Father Gring took echoed in the cavernous church, though no sound traveled beyond him. It was as if the building itself held its breath. He reached the altar, his cassock plastered to his chest by the icy water. The figure beside him, the one who had led him from the confessional, waited, silent, patient. Father Gring's voice trembled as he began to speak, but the words felt fragile, like they might shatter before reaching the ears of those who had waited 40 years for him to speak. I remember now, he whispered, everything. The crash, the bus, the children, the woman, the priest. His throat closed around the words and the water lapped higher, forcing him to pause. I drove away. I left them. I tried to forget. I built my life on lies. I thought I could pray it away. The figures did not flinch. They did not nod. They did not judge. They merely waited, their eyes absorbing every word, as if the confession itself had weight and substance in the space between them. The figure holding his hand spoke, its voice echoing like water rushing through a tunnel. Confess fully, do not spare yourself. Do not hide behind excuses, speak it all. They deserve it, you owe them this. Father Gring swallowed. He could feel the years of avoidance pressing on him like a tide. Names, faces, screams, the smell of rain, the cold bite of the water, everything flooded back at once. His knees buckled, but he stayed upright, drawing from some deep reserve, some fragment of courage he did not know he possessed. The bus, 23 lives lost, he faltered. The water lapped at his chest, icy fingers of truth sinking deep. I abandoned them. I ran. I let fear and shame dictate my actions. I lived my life pretending, and for that I am sorry. To God, to the world, to them. The silence stretched, heavy and tangible, and then a shift. The 23 figures leaned forward slightly, just enough to show acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but recognition. They had been heard. The weight of 40 years lifted fractionally, as though speaking the truth had reshaped the very air around him. The figure beside him released his hand. The water began to recede slowly, as though satisfied, leaving behind only the cold dampness on the stone floor. Light, pale and fractured, filtered through the broken windows. Father Gring sank to his knees, exhausted, trembling, alive to the enormity of what he had finally admitted. And for the first time in 40 years, he felt the eyes of the lost on him, and he knew. The confession was not for his own absolution. It was for theirs. Feel it pressing in from all sides, a weight that was neither physical nor entirely mental. The pews were still, the 23 figures unmoving, their eyes fixed on him with patient insistence. The water had begun to recede slowly, pooling around his knees but no longer rising. Every sound, the dripping, the faint rush of wind through broken windows, was amplified in the emptiness. He waited, chest heaving, fingers pressed into the wet stone that smelled faintly of rust and river mud. The confession had poured from him like a torrent long dammed, raw and unfiltered, and now a strange calm had settled over the church. It was not relief exactly, nor absolution. It was something heavier, something almost like acknowledgement. The truth had been spoken and it was heard. Then slowly, imperceptibly at first, the figures in the pews shifted. A nod here, a tilt of a head there, not gestures of forgiveness but of recognition. They had existed, they had suffered, they had waited 40 years, and now their patience had been met with confession. The weight of years of secrets buried beneath false narratives and quiet self-deception began to lift from Father Gring's shoulders. He remained kneeling, exhausted, shivering in the cold and wet, the sound of his own breathing loud in the cavernous space. For the first time, he understood that this was not about absolution from God, or even from men. It was about being seen, about acknowledgement of the lives lost and the choices made, about the truth finally finding a place in the world, even if it was only within these walls. Outside, the storm had softened to a steady rain. Light fractured through the stained glass, illuminating the nave in shards of color that danced across the wet stone floor. Father Gring pressed his forehead to the altar, closed his eyes, and let himself feel the enormity of what had just occurred. The 23 silent figures, witnesses of fate and consequence, had done what no living person could. They had reminded him that the truth carries its own weight, and that even decades of concealment could not undo what was already written in the world. He did not rise immediately. He did not rush to leave. He stayed kneeling in the cold, wet church, listening to the silence that was no longer oppressive but expectant. And somewhere deep in the marrow of his being, he knew that this was the final act of a confession 40 years in the making. He could feel it in his chest first, a weight, cold and heavy, pressing against his ribs, making each breath a struggle. The church around him felt unmoored, as if the walls and ceiling had drifted away, leaving only shadows and the smell of wet stone. Somewhere, water trickled endlessly, rhythmical and deliberate, like the heartbeat of the building itself. Outside, rain pelted against the windows, distant now muted, as if the world beyond had ceased to exist. When he dared to lift his gaze, the pews were empty no longer. 23 faces loomed before him, rising silently, impossibly, from the rows of seats he had crossed 1,000 times. They formed a crescent around him, faces soaked, clothes dripping, water spreading across the cold floor like black ink pooling over memory. One figure stepped forward, a man whose presence drew the air tight in his lungs. Thomas Howard, the driver, the one who had died that night 40 years ago, yet now stood waiting. His eyes were not filled with rage or hatred. Far worse, they were full of disappointment, not for them but for him. "Do you understand?" The man's voice cut through the dripping, through the cold. Father Gring shook his head slightly. He wanted to say yes, wanted to claim comprehension, but the truth was a chasm too wide to cross. He had taken their lives, yes, but what they had lost went beyond death. Futures erased, children never born, mornings that would never dawn, meals that would never be shared, the quiet accumulation of ordinary life that he had stolen without realizing it. "They've been waiting," Howard said, voice low but steady. "Not in a place you know. Not heaven, not hell, not purgatory. Waiting in the cold, in the dark, as the water filled their lungs, as time ran out, and still they waited." Father Gring tried the words that had always been safe, practiced, measured. I'm sorry." But the syllables felt wrong, hollow, obscene against the weight of their truth. Then a woman spoke, voice cutting through the water and silence, firm, unyielding, a presence that could not be ignored. Elderly, dressed in a floral pattern faded by time, her eyes held him captive. "Was he," she asked, "sorry you died, or sorry he's caught, sorry he must remember what he chose to forget?" Father Gring had no reply. Both were true. Neither were. The distinction had crumbled under the weight of 40 years. "They needed you to know," the woman continued. "Not the story in the papers, not the cold, sanitized account. The truth. They died because someone was careless, because someone chose convenience over care, because someone's life, yours, was stacked against theirs and nobody else ever knew." The water crept higher around his ankles, tugging at the hem of his robe. Each figure stood silent, patient, not demanding forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Father Gring shivered, wet and trembling, and realized at last that confession had never been about God. It had been about them. Their waiting had lasted decades, and now it had found him. And in that moment, drenched, shivering, surrounded by the silent weight of lives cut short, he understood that the truth, finally seen, finally known, was heavier than any absolution he had ever offered, and it would remain with him forever. The cold gripped him like iron, pressing into his chest, twisting the air from his lungs. The water had climbed, dark and heavy, curling around the altar, soaking the cloth, oozing into the wood like ink spilled on parchment. His cassock floated like kelp, dragging him down even as he remained on his knees. Each inhale was a fight, each exhale a surrender. He dared to ask what came next, though a part of him knew the answer would burn. Thomas Howerin's eyes flicked to the others. Words passed silently, a language older than speech, and then they returned to Father Gring. "You've done what was required," Howerin said. "Now we leave." A ripple passed through the air, the tension of decades finally easing. The bus, the drowning, the long, cold wait, it could end. Father Gring's throat tightened. "And me?" he whispered, voice barely a rasp. Howerin's face shifted, fragments overlaying fragments, 23 selves starring from one mask. "You remain," he said. "Every story requires a witness. Someone must stay, someone must feel the water, keep the memory alive. That is the balance." Then the truth landed like a stone in the pit of Father Gring's stomach. The rising water wasn't symbolic. The cold in his chest wasn't a memory. He had been drowning all along. Since that night, since the first confession door opened, maybe even longer. 40 years of slow suffocation he had refused to name. The figures around him began to dissolve, their forms misting away like fog at sunrise. The water dripping from them vanished. The bluish hue of death faded from their faces. For a heartbeat, he glimpsed them as they might have been alive. The elderly woman surrounded by grandchildren, her laugh full and warm. The young man thriving midlife, full of accomplishments. The children married, laughing, alive. Then the vision vanished, leaving only the empty church, the hollow echo of their waiting, and Father Gring alone. The water swirled around him, cold, thick with the taste of diesel, mud, and the brine of the estuary at high tide. He tried to rise. His legs betrayed him. Or perhaps they had never been his to command. Perhaps he had been paralyzed since the moment the car struck the bus 40 years ago, and the life he had lived was only a dream, a story he had told himself to escape the truth. It licked higher over his chin than his nose. He gasped, lungs already filled, a panic rising sharp and immediate. The church seemed endless, the water endless, and yet at the edge of his consciousness, a clarity settled. This was his penance, his reckoning, and there would be no relief until he surrendered entirely to the cold and the memory he had denied for decades. The water had swallowed him completely, yet beneath the roar in his ears, a faint chorus emerged. Distorted voices, singing a hymn he half remembered as though filtered through layers of water and time. Beneath it, another sound, metal bending, glass splintering, the strangled cries of 40 years ago, mixed with the song. The bus tilting, the world collapsing, a symphony of panic and prayer he had never allowed himself to truly hear. Then it hit him. This wasn't the confessional. This wasn't St. Cyprian's. He wasn't kneeling on stone. He was submerged in the Lahn estuary that November night 4 decades past. Every moment since had been a shadow, a memory disguised as life. The water's chill, the pressure against his chest, it had always been here. Always. Infinite. The last thing he glimpsed before the blackness claimed him was the crucifix above the altar. Christ's eyes were fixed on him, expression inscrutable, grief, pity, judgment, or something that had no name in any language Father Gring knew. Morning arrived as though nothing had happened. The storm had scattered, leaving a sky so impossibly blue it seemed painted. The sun spilled warmth over streets dotted with evaporating puddles and white salt stains. Mrs. Henley, peering curiously from the house next door, noticed the church door ajar, uncharacteristic for Father Gring. Inside, she found him slumped in the confessional by the altar, head tilted back against the wood, body still. The doctor examining him declared it likely a heart attack. Nothing remarkable for a man who had carried burdens silently for decades. Stress. Mrs. Henley shook her head. He had seemed weary, distracted, but nothing more. The doctor filled his forms, neat, impersonal, and the world continued its tidy routine. The funeral was modest. 24 parishioners, a handful of neighboring clergy. A bishop's envoy spoke carefully of his devotion and service, and then the earth swallowed him, as it had long ago, leaving behind only questions, echoes, and the faint memory of a hymn sung underwater, where time and water merged, and Father Gring's 40-year penance finally reached its end. The sunlight spilled through the stained glass windows like a promise, dust motes floating lazily in the golden beams. The church felt alive again, warm, orderly, predictable. Choirs sang on schedule, children ran along the aisles, and the smell of polished wood mixed with incense, nothing out of place. But the memory of the old confessional, the one nearest the altar, lingered in subtle ways. No one spoke of it. No one saw it because it had been erased from the world. Yet Mrs. Henley, who still tended the rectory with quiet devotion, sometimes paused when walking past where it had once stood. A fleeting sense of wrongness, an itch beneath her awareness, something unresolved. Occasionally she would find herself holding the tarnished bust token again, as though it had a weight of its own, pressing a question she could not answer. Father Akoro was content with the physical renewal, the repaired roof, the trimmed garden, the returning parishioners. He had no reason to question the past. The old wood was gone, the ashes buried. Yet on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the gaps in the windows and the long shadows of the pews stretched across the floor, a faint memory seemed to ripple through the church, like water beneath stone. And somewhere in that subtle hum, the truth of what had been, the waiting, the drowning, the confessions unheard, remained, a ghostly echo hidden beneath every polished surface, beneath every hymn, beneath the serene normalcy of St. Cyprian. Life went on. The bindweed grew, stubborn and untamed, creeping through cracks and around tombstones. Children played among its tendrils, oblivious. Parishioners came and went, their prayers rising and fading. Yet the bust token, tucked away in a drawer, waited silently. It remembered everything. The church, under Father Akoro's care, began to fill in ways no one had expected. On Sundays, the nave buzzed quietly with life, half full, sometimes more, a modest miracle by St. Cyprian's standards. Conversations about Father Gring had vanished almost entirely. The older parishioners who remembered him drifted away, passed on, or simply faded into obscurity. His name lingered only in the parish ledger, a line in a list of past priests, marked by the length of his service and the ordinary manner of his death. Yet on certain November nights, when rain lashed against the west-facing windows and wind sneaked through the centuries-old cracks, Father Akoro, rational, measured, devoted to reason, sometimes heard it, a faint, persistent dripping. He inspected the roof, checked the glass, traced every seam, and found nothing. But the sound persisted, curling around the edges of the church like a secret. And sometimes, when he worked alone in his office late into the night, drafting sermons or replying to parishioner letters, he felt it, an undeniable presence. Not in the nave, not near the altar, but in the corner where the confessional had once stood. The floorboards there, a patch roughly the size of a kneeling man, never seemed fully dry. During his first winter at St. Cyprian's, he called in builders, worried about hidden leaks or rot. They found nothing, just solid wood, sound and strong. They said the dark patch was likely a stain from the old confessional that had long since been removed. Father Akoro accepted it logically, but on stormy November evenings he swore the wood appeared wet, glistening faintly as if some slow, unseen seepage still rose from beneath. He never investigated further. He told himself it was fatigue, imagination, the brain inventing patterns in darkness, the natural unease of solitude in a vast, empty building. Probably all true. Still, he never lingered past 11 o'clock, and he never sat where the confessional had been. There was a quiet, stubborn instinct he could not name, a knot of dread he would not admit even to himself, that warned if he did, if he took that empty seat, something would return. Something that would knock 3 on wood that no longer existed, and he would have no choice but to answer.